The dust cloud from the departing stagecoach hung in the air like a shroud as Clara Whitford stood at the edge of Kansas territory, her worn leather valise clutched in one hand and her late husband's pocket watch in the other. The timepiece had stopped working 3 months ago, the same day Samuel drew his last breath in their small farmhouse bedroom. She hadn't wound it since. Ahead stretched the vast expanse of prairie grass, burnt golden by the relentless summer sun. The trail to Redemption Creek wound through that sea of amber, disappearing into red rock canyons that rose like ancient sentinels against the horizon. The air shimmered with heat, carrying the acrid scent of scorched earth and sage. "You sure about this, ma'am?" The stagecoach driver, a grizzled man named Josiah, peered down at her from his perch. "Redemption Creek ain't no place for a lady alone. Rough folks out there." Clara lifted her chin, squinting against the glare. "I've buried a husband and sold everything I own to make this journey. Mr. Josiah, I believe I'm certain enough." The driver shrugged and snapped the reins. As the coach rolled away, leaving her truly alone for the first time in her life, Clara allowed herself one moment of doubt. Then she picked up her valise and began walking. The journey took 3 days on foot, hitching rides with passing wagons when fortune allowed. Each mile stripped away another layer of her former life, the proper Eastern lady, the dutiful wife, the woman who kept her eyes downcast and her opinions silent. By the time she crested the final ridge and saw Redemption Creek sprawled below, she felt raw and new, like a snake that had shed its skin. The town was exactly what she'd expected and nothing like she'd imagined. A main street of packed dirt ran between 2 rows of weather-beaten buildings, saloons, a general store, a hotel that leaned slightly to the left, and a handful of other establishments whose purposes remained unclear. Horses stood tied to hitching posts, their tails swishing at flies. Men in dust-covered clothes moved between the buildings, spurs jangling with each step. Clara made her way down the slope, her boots sliding on loose stones. Several heads turned as she passed, eyes tracking her movement with a mixture of curiosity and something else she couldn't quite name. A woman traveling alone was unusual enough, but a woman in a black morning dress carrying a seamstress's kit was something else entirely. She'd telegraphed ahead about renting the small shop at the end of Main Street, the one that had sat empty since the previous owner died of fever. The landlord, a Mr. Cornelius Blackwood, met her at the door with keys and a skeptical expression. "You're the seamstress from Kansas?" He looked her up and down, taking in her travel-stained dress and the determined set of her jaw. "Figured you'd be older, maybe uglier." "I'm sorry to disappoint," Clara replied dryly, taking the keys from his meaty hand. "Though I assure you, my needle skills have nothing to do with my appearance." Blackwood grunted. "Rent's due 1st of each month. No exceptions. And keep your door locked after dark. This ain't Kansas. Mrs. Whitford." After he left, Clara stood in the dusty shop and allowed herself to breathe. Sunlight filtered through grimy windows, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the air. The space was small but serviceable. A front room for customers, a back room for living quarters. She set down her valise and began the work of making it home. Within a week, Clara had transformed the shop. The windows gleamed. Clean curtains hung in their frames, and a painted sign reading "Whitford's Tailoring and Mending" swung gently in the desert breeze. She'd set up her sewing machine, a Singer model that had been her mother's, in the front window where passing folks could see her at work. Business came slowly at first. The cowboys and drifters who populated Redemption Creek weren't accustomed to having their clothes mended rather than simply replaced. But word spread of her skill with a needle, and soon she had a steady stream of torn shirts, split seams, and worn-through knees to repair. She learned to navigate the unspoken rules of the town, keep her eyes down when passing the saloons, never venture out after the sun set, ignore the catcalls and crude invitations that followed her to Sunday service at the small chapel on the hill. Most importantly, never take sides in the conflicts that erupted with regularity between the various factions that called Redemption Creek home. It was during her 3rd week that she first heard talk of the Midnight Rider. "Saw him again last night. Jake Morrison. A ranch hand, said as Clara measured him for a new shirt. Out by Devil's Canyon, just sitting on that black horse of his, watching the moon rise. You're seeing shadows. His companion, Will, scoffed. Ain't no midnight rider, just stories to scare children and fools. Tell that to Sheriff Briggs, Jake countered. Found him strung up by his ankles outside the jail last week with a note pinned to his chest. Stop taking bribes, or next time you'll hang proper. That weren't no shadow that done that. Clara kept her attention on her measuring tape, but her ears strained for every word. She'd heard whispers of this mysterious figure, a lone horseman who appeared in the depths of night, dealing out his own brand of justice to those the law wouldn't touch. Some said he was a ghost, others a Mexican bandit. Still others claimed he was a renegade soldier gone mad from the war. What does he look like? She found herself asking. Then immediately regretted the question as both men turned to stare at her. Nobody knows for certain, Jake said slowly. Wears all black, keeps his face covered, rides a horse black as midnight itself. They say if you see him coming for you, it's already too late. That night, Clara stood at her window looking out at the darkness beyond the town limits. The moon was new, leaving only starlight to illuminate the landscape. She thought she saw a movement on the ridge, a shadow darker than the rest. But when she blinked, it was gone. She told herself it was imagination, the product of too many whispered stories and her own loneliness. But as she turned away from the window, a shiver ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the cool desert air. The next morning brought trouble of a different kind. Clara arrived at her shop to find 3 men waiting outside, members of the White Brotherhood, a group of supremacists who'd been growing bolder in recent months. Their leader, a man named Thomas Garrett with pale eyes and a scar across his left cheek, leaned against her door. Mrs. Whitford, he said, tipping his hat mockingly. We have a proposition for you. Clara's hand tightened on her key. I'm not interested in any propositions, Mr. Garrett. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do. Hear us out, he said, not moving from the door. The Brotherhood is planning a celebration. A rally, you might say. We need flags made. Good, proud flags that show what we stand for. You being the only seamstress in 50 miles, we figured you'd be honored to help. I'm afraid I'm too busy with other orders. Clara said firmly, perhaps you could try the next town over. Garrett's smile faded. That's disappointing. Mrs. Whitford. Very disappointing. A woman alone needs friends in a place like this. Would be a shame if something happened to this nice little shop of yours. The threat hung in the air between them. Clara felt her heart racing but kept her voice steady. Are you threatening me, Mr. Garrett? Just making an observation, he said, finally stepping away from the door. You think about it. We'll be back in a few days for your answer. They left, but Clara's hands shook as she unlocked her door. She knew what refusing them could mean, had seen what happened to those who crossed the Brotherhood, but she also knew what accepting would mean, using her skills to create symbols of hatred and division. That night, she worked late, trying to lose herself in the familiar rhythm of needle and thread. The lamp cast a warm circle of light around her, holding back the darkness that pressed against the windows. She was so absorbed in her work that she almost missed the sound, the soft clip-clop of hooves on the packed dirt street. Clara froze, needle suspended in midair. The sound stopped directly outside her shop. Her heart hammered as she slowly turned toward the window, but the lamplight turned the glass into a mirror, showing only her own pale reflection. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the sound retreated, fading into the night. Clara forced herself to finish the seam she was working on before carefully making her way to the door. She peered out through the small window beside it but saw only empty street. It wasn't until morning that she discovered what the mysterious visitor had left, a leather pouch hanging from her door handle, heavy with silver coins. More than enough to cover the cost of her ruined shop. Should Garrett and his men make good on their threat? But it was what she saw from her doorway that made her breath catch. There, on the ridge overlooking the town, sat a lone figure on horseback. Even at this distance, She could make out the black clothes, the broad-brimmed hat that shadowed his features. The Midnight Rider, watching over Redemption Creek as the sun painted the desert in shades of gold and crimson. As she stared, he touched the brim of his hat in what might have been a salute. Then he turned his horse and vanished over the ridge, leaving Clara standing in her doorway with a pouch of silver in her hand and a strange flutter in her chest that had nothing to do with fear. The acrid smell of smoke pulled Clara from her restless sleep. For a moment, she lay still in the darkness, wondering if she'd dreamed it. Then she heard the sound of breaking glass from the front of her shop. She threw on her shawl and rushed to the doorway between her living quarters and the shop. Orange light flickered through the cracks, and her heart sank. The front window was shattered, and flames were already licking at the curtains she'd hung with such care. Clara grabbed the water bucket from beside her washstand and threw it on the flames, but it was like spitting into a forge. The fire had taken hold of the wooden shelves where she stored fabric, and black smoke began filling the room. She stumbled back, coughing, her eyes streaming. The back door. She needed to get out the back door, but as she turned, she remembered her sewing machine. Her mother's singer still sat by the broken window. Without thinking, she pulled her shawl over her nose and mouth and plunged into the smoke. The heat hit her like a physical blow. She could barely see, but her hands found the familiar shape of the machine. It was heavier than she remembered, and her lungs screamed for clean air as she dragged it toward the back room. Just a few more feet. Strong hands suddenly gripped her shoulders, pulling her backward. She tried to resist, clinging to the sewing machine, but the hands were insistent. Then she was outside in the cool night air, gasping and coughing while someone pressed a wet cloth to her face. "Breathe," a deep voice commanded. "Slow and easy." When her vision cleared, she found herself looking up at Tom Hartley, the blacksmith. His face was streaked with soot, and other townspeople were forming a bucket brigade to fight the flames. But it was too late for her shop. The fire had spread to the roof, sending sparks spiraling into the star-filled sky. "My machine," she croaked, trying to sit up. "It's here," Tom said, gesturing to where someone had placed the singer safely away from the fire. "Nearly got yourself killed for a sewing machine, Mrs. Whitford." Clara watched numbly as her new life burned. Everything she'd built in the past weeks, the carefully organized threads, the bolts of fabric, the half-finished garments waiting for their owners, all consumed by flames that painted the night in shades of destruction. Garrett's boys were seen riding away just before the fire started. Tom said quietly, "Sheriff won't do nothing about it. Of course, he's in their pocket deep as a mine shaft." Clara nodded, unsurprised. She'd refused to make their flags. And this was the price. The pouch of silver the Midnight Rider had left wouldn't rebuild what she'd lost. Not just the materials, but the trust she'd begun to build with the townspeople. Who would bring their mending to a seamstress who couldn't even keep her own shop safe? The crowd began to disperse as the fire burned itself out, leaving only charred timbers and ash where her shop had stood. A few women from the church offered her shelter for the night, but Clara politely declined. She couldn't bear their pitying looks, their whispered conversations about the poor widow who'd tried to make it on her own. Instead, she sat on a wooden crate across the street, her mother's sewing machine at her feet, and watched the embers glow in the darkness. The smell of smoke clung to her hair and clothes, a bitter reminder of how quickly dreams could turn to ash in a place like Redemption Creek. She didn't hear the horse approach this time. One moment she was alone. The next a shadow fell across her, blocking out the stars. Clara looked up to see a figure in black astride a horse so dark it seemed to absorb the light. "You should have taken their offer," she said bitterly. "Would have saved us both some trouble." The rider dismounted in one fluid motion, his spurs making no sound as his boots touched the ground. He wore a black bandana across the lower half of his face, and his hat was pulled low, leaving only his eyes visible, dark eyes that held a strange light as they surveyed the destroyed shop. "You think I should have made flags for men who would hang my neighbors from the nearest tree?" Clara continued, anger giving her courage. Who would drive out anyone who doesn't look or think like them? The midnight rider reached into his coat and withdrew another leather pouch, larger than the first. He set it on the crate beside her, then stepped back. "I don't want your money," Clara said, her voice catching. "It won't bring back what I've lost." For a long moment, he stood silent. Then he reached up and pulled down the bandana, revealing a face marked by sun and hardship. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 35, with a strong jaw shadowed by several days' growth of beard. A thin scar ran from his left temple to his cheekbone. "Money won't bring back what I've lost either," he said, his voice low and rough. "But it can buy lumber and nails. It can buy new fabric and thread. It can buy another chance." "Why do you care?" Clara asked. "Why does any of this matter to you?" His eyes moved from the ruined shop to her face. "Because someone needs to. Because men like Garrett think they own this town and everyone in it. Because—" He stopped, jaw tightening. "Because I've seen what happens when good people do nothing." He pulled the bandana back up and turned toward his horse. But Clara found herself standing, words tumbling out before she could stop them. "They'll just burn it again, or worse. I'm one woman alone. I can't fight them." The midnight rider paused with one hand on his saddle. "No," he agreed. "You can't fight them alone." Then he was mounted and gone, melting into the darkness like smoke. Clara stood staring after him, the weight of the coin pouch heavy in her hands. Around her, the town slept on, unaware of the conversation that had just taken place in the shadow of destruction. She spent the rest of the night salvaging what she could from the ruins. Her scissors, miraculously unharmed in their metal case, a few spools of thread that had rolled under the back step, her measuring tape, singed but usable. By dawn, she had a pitifully small pile of belongings. But it was something. Tom Hartley found her there as the sun painted the mountains pink. "Mrs. Whitford," he said awkwardly. "My wife sent me to fetch you. Says you need a proper breakfast and a place to wash up." Clara wanted to refuse, to maintain her independence even in the face of disaster. But she was tired, so tired. And the kindness in Tom's weathered face was genuine. "Thank you," she said simply. The Hartley home was modest but clean, filled with the noise of 3 young children and the smell of bacon frying. Mary Hartley took one look at Clara and immediately set about heating water for a bath. "Don't you say a word," Mary commanded when Clara tried to protest. "You've had a terrible night, and you'll feel better once you're clean. I've got a dress that should fit you well enough until we can see about getting you proper clothes." As Clara soaked in the metal tub, listening to the sounds of family life through the thin walls, she felt tears sliding down her cheeks for the first time since the fire. She'd been so focused on surviving, on maintaining her composure, that she hadn't allowed herself to truly feel the loss. But it wasn't just the shop she mourned. It was the reminder that she was truly alone in the world, that there was no one to stand beside her when trouble came calling. Samuel would have known what to do. He would have... No. Clara stopped that line of thought firmly. Samuel was gone, and dwelling on what he would have done wouldn't change her circumstances. She had to move forward with what she had, not what she'd lost. When she emerged, dressed in Mary's borrowed blue calico, she found Tom and several other men gathered in the front room. They fell silent as she entered. "Mrs. Whitford," Tom began. "We've been talking. What Garrett and his boys did ain't right. Now, the sheriff won't do nothing, and most of us got families to think of. But we figure we can help you rebuild, quiet-like. No one needs to know who's doing the work." Clara felt her throat tighten. I don't know what to say." "Don't say nothing." Another man, James Cooper, spoke up. "Just let us know when you're ready to start building." That afternoon, Clara used some of the Midnight Rider's silver to purchase lumber and basic supplies. True to their word, men began showing up at odd hours to help with the construction. They worked quickly and quietly, always keeping watch for Garrett's riders. But Clara knew it was only a matter of time before the Brotherhood noticed. She'd defied them once. They wouldn't let it stand. As she worked alongside the men, sorting salvaged nails and measuring boards, She found herself glancing toward the ridgeline, wondering if dark eyes were watching over them. 3 days into the rebuilding, her fears were realized. She was alone at the building site, having sent the others home for supper, when she heard horses approaching. Her hand went instinctively to the hammer at her belt, though she knew it would be little defense against what was coming. Thomas Garrett rode at the head of 5 men, their faces hard with purpose. They reined in just short of the new framework, and Garrett leaned forward in his saddle. "Well, he said. "Looks like someone didn't get the message." Clara stepped out from behind a support beam, chin raised. "I got your message, Mr. Garrett. I simply chose to ignore it." His pale eyes narrowed. "That's a dangerous choice, Mrs. Whitford. This time, we might not stop with just your shop." The threat hung heavy in the air, and Clara felt real fear slice through her. But before she could respond, a new voice cut through the tension. "Evening, gentlemen." The midnight rider sat atop his black horse at the edge of the building site. He'd appeared as silently as a ghost, and Garrett's men shifted nervously in their saddles. "This ain't your concern, rider," Garrett said, though his voice had lost some of its confidence. "Everything in this town, it's my concern." The rider replied. His hands rested easy on his saddle horn, but Clara noticed the way his coat was pushed back, revealing the handles of 2 revolvers, especially when it involved 6 armed men threatening 1 unarmed woman. She had her chance to be reasonable. Garrett insisted. "The Brotherhood? The Brotherhood is a blight on this land," the midnight rider interrupted, his voice hard as iron. "And you, Garrett, are nothing but a coward who hides behind numbers and darkness to terrorize decent folk." Garrett's face flushed red. "You calling me a coward?" "I'm calling you worse than that. But there's ladies present, so I'll keep it polite." For a moment, violence trembled in the air like heat lightning. Then Garrett jerked his reins, wheeling his horse around. "This ain't over," he snarled. "Not by a long shot." They rode off in a cloud of dust, and Clara realized she'd been holding her breath. She exhaled shakily, gripping the support beam to steady herself. The midnight rider dismounted and approached her. "You all right?" "Yes," Clara managed. "Thank you, again." He looked around at the construction site, taking in the progress they'd made. "You're rebuilding fast." "I have help. Good people who aren't afraid to, who are willing to help despite the risk. There's more good people in this town than bad," he said. "They just need someone to remind them of it sometimes." Clara studied him, this mysterious man who appeared from nowhere to defend those who couldn't defend themselves. "Who are you?" she asked softly. "Really?" His eyes met hers above the bandana. "Someone who got tired of doing nothing," he said. Then he touched the brim of his hat and turned back to his horse. "Wait," Clara called. He paused. "They'll come back. Garrett won't let this stand." "No," the rider agreed. "He won't." He swung into the saddle with that same fluid grace. "Lock your doors tonight, Mrs. Whitford, and trust that you're not as alone as you think." Then he was gone, leaving Clara standing among the skeletal remains of her new shop, wondering what price they'd all pay for defying Thomas Garrett and his Brotherhood of Hate. The thunder of hooves and gunfire shattered the peaceful Sunday morning. Clara was in her newly rebuilt shop, pressing a shirt for the minister. When the first screams erupted from Main Street, she dropped the iron and rushed to the window. Chaos had descended on Redemption Creek. Masked riders charged through town, firing their guns into the air and throwing torches onto rooftops. The bank's windows exploded in a shower of glass as men with grain sacks over their heads stormed inside. Down the street, flames were already licking at the general store's awning. Clara's first instinct was to bar the door and hide, but then she saw Mrs. Chen, the laundryman's wife, stumbling through the smoke with her infant daughter. Without thinking, Clara threw open her door. "In here!" she shouted. "Mrs. Chen half fell through the doorway, clutching her baby. Clara slammed the door behind them and helped the woman to a chair. The baby was wailing, her face red from the smoke. "The grain storage! Mrs.!" Chen gasped. "They set fire to the grain storage!" My husband, he went to help. Clara's blood ran cold. The grain storage was where many families kept their winter supplies. If it burned, half the town would face starvation before spring. More gunfire erupted outside. Closer now. Clara peered through the window and saw townspeople running in all directions, some trying to form bucket brigades, others simply fleeing the violence. The sheriff was nowhere to be seen, probably hiding in his office, waiting for it to be over. A woman's scream cut through the chaos, high and terrified. Clara saw young Beth Morrison, Jake's sister, trapped between a burning wagon and 3 of the raiders. One had grabbed her arm and was dragging her toward his horse. "Stay here," Clara told Mrs. Chen, grabbing a heavy pressing iron from her work table. "No, Mrs." Chen caught her sleeve. "You'll be killed." But Clara was already moving. She slipped out the back door and crept along the alley, the iron clutched in her sweaty palm. The heat from the fires was intense, and black smoke stung her eyes. She could hear Beth sobbing, pleading with her captors. Clara reached the corner of the building and peered around. The 3 raiders had their backs to her, focused on Beth. One was laughing, an ugly sound that made Clara's stomach turn. She took a deep breath, said a quick prayer, and stepped out from cover. The iron caught the nearest raider across the back of his head with a sickening thud. He crumpled without a sound. The other 2 spun around, momentarily stunned to see a woman in a flour-dusted apron wielding a pressing iron like a war club. That moment of surprise was all Beth needed. She wrenched free and ran, disappearing into the smoke. "You little—" One raider reached for his gun. The crack of a rifle shot split the air, and the raider's hat flew off his head. Everyone froze. The midnight rider emerged from the smoke atop his black horse, rifle in hand. Behind him, Clara could make out other riders, townspeople who'd armed themselves and rallied to fight back. "Drop your weapons," the rider commanded. "Now." The remaining conscious raider looked between his fallen companion and the rifle pointed at his chest. Slowly, he let his gun fall to the dirt. "Clara, get back inside," the rider said without taking his eyes off the raiders. Clara didn't need to be told twice. She retreated to her shop, where Mrs. Chen waited anxiously. Together, they watched through the window as the tide of battle turned. The townspeople, led by the mysterious rider, drove the raiders back. Some fled on horseback. Others were captured and tied up in the street. But the damage was done. Half the town was burning. Clara could see families forming bucket brigades, desperately trying to save what they could. The grain storage was beyond help. A pillar of black smoke that could probably be seen for miles. Without hesitation, Clara began gathering supplies. "We need bandages," she told Mrs. Chen. "Torn sheets, anything clean. They'll be wounded." They worked frantically, tearing fabric into strips and preparing what medical supplies Clara had. Soon, injured townspeople began arriving. Clara's shop became an impromptu medical station, with women tending burns and gunshot wounds as best they could. Dr. Marcus Whitman, the town's only physician, moved between patients with grim efficiency. "Hold him down," he ordered Clara as he prepared to extract a bullet from Tom Hartley's shoulder. "This is going to hurt." Clara braced herself against Tom's thrashing as the doctor worked. She'd seen plenty of blood on the farm, but this was different. This was violence inflicted by men on their neighbors, all for money and meanness. "There, Doctor." Whitman dropped the bloody bullet into a basin. "You'll live, Tom, but keep that arm still for a few weeks." As the doctor moved to the next patient, Clara stayed with Tom, pressing a clean bandage to his wound. His wife Mary arrived moments later, white-faced but composed. "Oh, Tom," she breathed. "When I saw the smoke, I thought—" "I'm all right," he assured her, though his face was gray with pain. "Takes more than a bullet to stop a Hartley." The afternoon wore on in a blur of blood and smoke and tears. Clara lost count of how many wounds she cleaned, How many frightened children she comforted while their parents were treated. Her hands moved automatically. Years of precise needlework translating into steady stitches in human flesh. It was near sunset when she finally stepped outside for air. The fires were mostly out, leaving behind blackened ruins where businesses had stood that morning. Groups of men still patrolled the streets, watching for any raiders who might return. She found the midnight rider by the destroyed grain storage, helping salvage what little hadn't burned. His black clothes were gray with ash, and she could see exhaustion in the set of his shoulders. "How many dead?" she asked quietly. 3 townspeople, 6 raiders." He didn't look at her, focused on lifting a partially burned sack. Could have been worse. Could have been better if the sheriff had done his job. The rider made a sound that might have been a bitter laugh. Sheriff Briggs was busy protecting his own interests. Found him loading his wagon with goods from the bank vault during the robbery. Clara wasn't surprised, but the confirmation still stung. What happens now? Now? He finally turned to face her. The bandana had slipped during the fighting, and she could see the grim line of his mouth. "Now we bury the dead and rebuild again, and hope Garrett and his brotherhood don't decide to finish what these raiders started." "You think they were connected?" "I know they were. Recognized 2 of the dead raiders as Brotherhood men." He gestured toward the jail, where the captured outlaws were being held. "They planned this together. Create chaos, blame it on Mexican bandits, use the fear to drive out anyone who doesn't fit their idea of what this town should be." Clara felt anger rise in her throat like bile. All this death and destruction, just to spread their hatred? "Power," the rider corrected. "Hatred's just the tool they use to get it." They stood in silence for a moment, watching the sun set through the haze of smoke. Finally, Clara asked the question that had been burning in her mind all day. "In the grain storage, when the fighting started, I saw you pull the Hendersons out. The whole family. You could have been trapped, but you went in anyway." He shrugged. "Someone had to." "That's not an answer." He was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't respond. "Then, I had a family once. Wife, daughter, lost them in a fire set by men who thought we didn't belong. Couldn't save them." His voice was steady, but Clara heard the pain beneath it. "Now I save who I can." Clara's heart clenched. She wanted to say something, to offer comfort, but what words could ease that kind of loss? Instead, she reached out and touched his arm gently. He looked down at her hand, then up at her face. For a moment, his dark eyes were unguarded, showing depths of pain and loneliness that matched her own. Then the mask slipped back into place, and he stepped away. "You should get inside," he said. "There might be wounded who still need tending." Clara nodded, recognizing the dismissal. But as she turned to go, he called after her, "Clara!" She stopped, surprised by the use of her first name. "You were brave today. With Beth Morrison." "That took courage." "Or foolishness," she replied with a weak smile. "Sometimes they're the same thing." He pulled the bandana back up over his face. "Lock your doors tonight. This isn't over." Clara watched him walk back toward the smoke and ruins. This mysterious man who carried so much pain yet still found the strength to defend others. She thought of his family, lost to the same kind of hatred that plagued Redemption Creek, and understood a little better what drove him to ride through the darkness. Back in her shop, she found Dr. Whitman finishing with the last patient. The floor was stained with blood, and the air smelled of carbolic and smoke. Mrs. Chen had long since taken her baby home, leaving Clara alone with the evidence of the day's violence. "You did well today," the doctor said, washing his hands in a basin. "Steady hands, cool head. Ever think about learning proper nursing?" "I'm a seamstress," Clara replied automatically. "You're a healer," he corrected. "Whether you're mending clothes or people, it's the same gift. Think about it." After he left, Clara began the long process of cleaning up. She scrubbed blood from her floors, washed bandages that could be reused, tried to restore some order to her violated space, but she couldn't scrub away the memory of Beth Morrison's terrified face. or the sound of bullets whistling through the air, or the weight of the iron in her hand as she struck down a man. As night fell, she found herself standing at her window again, looking out at the damaged town. Lanterns bobbed in the darkness as people continued the cleanup, refusing to be broken by the day's violence. Somewhere out there, the Midnight Rider kept watch, a guardian born of tragedy who refused to let others suffer as he had. Clara touched the glass gently, thinking of all the loss this day had brought, all the fear and pain, but also thinking of the courage she'd witnessed. Ordinary people standing up to fight back, neighbors helping neighbors, a mysterious rider who asked for nothing but gave everything. "We're not alone," she whispered to the darkness. "None of us are alone." And somewhere in the distance, as if in answer, she heard the faint sound of hoofbeats on the wind. Clara stared at the bundle of supplies she'd gathered: dried beans, hardtack, a canteen of water, her mother's sewing kit, and Samuel's old revolver that she barely knew how to use. The practical part of her mind cataloged what else she might need for a journey into the unknown. The emotional part screamed that this was madness. 3 days had passed since the raid. 3 days of burying the dead, tending the wounded, and watching Thomas Garrett's men grow bolder. They rode through town in broad daylight now, making no effort to hide their association with the raiders. Sheriff Briggs had disappeared. Some said heading to Mexico with his stolen goods, without even the pretense of law. Redemption Creek teetered on the edge of chaos. Then had come the warning, slipped under her door in the dead of night. "Leave town by tomorrow, sunset or burn with it." Clara knew she should go. Every practical bone in her body told her to pack what little she owned and take the next stage to anywhere else. But as she stood in her rebuilt shop, looking at the bloodstains she couldn't quite scrub from the floorboards, something rebellious rose in her chest. She'd already lost one home to these men. She'd be damned if she'd give them another. The sound of approaching hoofbeats made her reach for the revolver, but it was only Jake Morrison, his arm still in a sling from a raider's bullet. "Mrs. Whitford," he said, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "You need to leave. Tonight, Garrett's planning something big, heard his men talking at the saloon." "I received their warning," Clara said calmly. "Then why are you still here?" Jake's voice cracked with frustration. "You can't fight them alone." "I'm tired of running. Jake, tired of letting men like Garrett decide who belongs and who doesn't. Being tired won't stop a bullet," he argued. "Please, Mrs. Whitford, my sister, Beth, she says she owes you her life. Don't make her watch you lose yours." Clara softened. "Tell Beth to stay inside tonight. Tell everyone you care about to stay inside." Jake left, shaking his head. Clara returned to her packing, but now with a different purpose. If she was leaving, it wouldn't be because Garrett drove her out. She'd leave on her own terms, when she was ready. As the sun began its descent toward the mountains, painting the desert in shades of copper and gold, Clara made her decision. She would go, but not to another town. She'd head into the wilderness, to the old mining camps in the hills. From there, she could figure out her next move without Garrett's men breathing down her neck. She was tying her bundle to her horse, a sturdy mare she'd bought with the Midnight Rider's silver, when the familiar sound of spurs made her freeze. Going somewhere? The Midnight Rider stood in the shadows of the alley, his black hat tilted at an angle that hid his eyes. "I thought it was time for a ride in the country," Clara said, trying for lightness. "I hear the desert is lovely this time of year. It's also deadly for a woman alone." He stepped into the fading light. "Garrett's men are already watching the roads. You won't make it 5 miles. "Then what do you suggest? That I stay here and let them burn me out again?" "I suggest," he said slowly, "that you let me help." Clara laughed bitterly. "You've helped enough. Half this town thinks you're the reason things have gotten worse. The other half prays for you like you're some kind of avenging angel. Either way, being associated with you is a death sentence." His jaw tightened. "You're right. I've brought nothing but trouble, but that doesn't change the fact that you need to leave. And I know ways out of this valley that Garrett's men have never heard of." "Why?" Clara demanded. Why do you care what happens to me?" For a long moment, he was silent. Then he reached up and pulled down his bandana completely, letting it hang loose around his neck. In the dying light, she could see his face clearly, the weathered skin, the thin scar, the eyes that held too much pain for a man his age. "Because you remind me of her," he said quietly. "My wife, Sarah. She had your courage, your stubbornness, your way of seeing the good in people even when they didn't deserve it." He paused. "I couldn't save her, but maybe I can save you." Clara felt her heart twist. "I'm not her. I'm not anyone's substitute for what they've lost." "No," he agreed. "You're not. You're Clara Whitford, who came to this God-forsaken place to start over, who stood up to the Brotherhood when grown men cowered, who hit a raider with a pressing iron to save a girl she barely knew." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "You're remarkable in your own right." Heat flooded Clara's cheeks, and she turned away. "Flattery won't change my mind." "Then how about truth?" He moved closer, and she caught the scent of leather and sage. "Garrett has 20 men coming from Silver City. They'll be here by midnight. This isn't about burning one shop or driving out one seamstress. They're planning to take the whole town, turn it into their fortress. Anyone who stood against them will be made an example of." Clara's blood chilled. "The families who helped rebuild my shop. Tom Hartley and his family are already gone. The Morrisons are leaving within the hour. Others are packing as we speak." He gestured to her bundled supplies. "You're not running. Clara, you're surviving. There's no shame in that." She looked around at her shop, at the town that had become her unlikely home. The setting sun turned everything golden, beautifying even the burn scars on nearby buildings. It seemed impossible that she'd been here only a few weeks. It felt like a lifetime. "All right," she said finally. "But I'm not going far, just to the old Fortuna mining camp. I know there's shelter there, and water. Fortuna's been abandoned for years. It's perfect." He moved to his horse, checking the rifle in its scabbard. "Can you ride in the dark?" "I grew up on a farm, Mr." She realized she still didn't know his name. "Elias," he said after a pause. "Elias Kane." "Well, Mr. Kane, I've been riding since before I could walk properly. The dark doesn't scare me." "Good, because we need to leave now." Clara quickly finished securing her supplies, then mounted her mare. The horse shifted nervously, sensing the tension in the air as they prepared to leave. Clara took one last look at her shop. "We'll come back," Elias said, reading her thoughts. "This isn't over." They rode out as the last sliver of sun disappeared behind the mountains. Elias led them not toward the main road, but through a maze of alleys and backyards, keeping to the shadows. Clara could hear sounds of preparation throughout the town, doors being barred, shutters closing, the urgent whisper of families making their own escape plans. At the edge of town, Elias held up a hand for silence. In the distance, Clara could see lights bobbing along the main road, riders approaching from the east. "Garrett's reinforcements," Elias murmured, "earlier than expected." They waited, pressed against the side of a barn, until the riders passed. Then Elias led them into the desert proper, following no trail Clara could see. The moon hadn't risen yet, leaving only starlight to guide them, but his horse seemed to know the way. They rode in silence for an hour. The only sounds, the creak of leather and the soft thud of hooves on sandy soil. The familiar scents of sage and creosote filled Clara's nostrils. Despite the danger behind them, she felt a strange peace settle over her. Out here, under the vast canopy of stars, the petty hatreds of men seemed small and insignificant. "There," Elias pointed to a darker mass against the sky. "The entrance to Skeleton Canyon. From there, it's another hour to Fortuna." As they entered the canyon, the walls rose up on either side like giant sentinels. Their horses' hooves echoed off the stone, creating an eerie chorus. Clara found herself pressing closer to Elias, grateful for his steady presence. "Tell me about Sarah," she said softly, needing to break the oppressive silence. She felt rather than saw him tense. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "She was a schoolteacher, came out from Pennsylvania to teach the mining camp's children. Hair like honey, eyes like the summer sky. His voice carried a wealth of remembered love. I was working as a deputy marshal then, trying to bring law to lawless places. She said I was too serious, needed to smile more, so she made it her mission to find reasons for me to smile. She sounds wonderful. She was. They rounded a bend in the canyon, and he continued. We built a little house outside Prescott. She planted roses by the door, said every home needed beauty. We were expecting our first child when he stopped abruptly. Clara waited, but he didn't continue. She could fill in the rest anyway. Fire, death, loss that drove a lawman to become a midnight rider seeking his own form of justice. They emerged from the canyon to find the moon had risen, bathing the desert in silver light. The landscape looked otherworldly, all shadows and gleaming stone. In the distance, Clara could make out the dark shapes of abandoned buildings climbing the hillside. Fortuna, Elias announced. Gold played out 5 years ago. There's a few buildings still intact, and the well still has water. As they approached the ghost town, Clara felt a shiver run down her spine. Empty windows stared like hollow eyes, and the wind moaned through broken doorways. But it was shelter, and it was far from Thomas Garrett's reach. Elias led them to what had once been the assay office, a stone building more intact than the rest. Inside, moonlight filtered through gaps in the roof, illuminating a space empty except for a few broken chairs and decades of dust. I'll get a fire going, Elias said. It gets cold up here at night. While he gathered wood, Clara unsaddled the horses and gave them water from the well. The simple, familiar tasks calmed her nerves. By the time she returned to the office, Elias had a small fire crackling in the old fireplace. They sat in companionable silence, sharing Clara's hardtack and dried fruit. The fire cast dancing shadows on the walls, and for a moment, Clara could almost pretend they were just two travelers sharing a meal, not fugitives from a town descending into chaos. What happens tomorrow? She asked finally. Tomorrow, we see what Garrett does when he realizes you're gone. He might send men to search, or he might focus on consolidating his control of the town. Elias stared into the fire. Either way, we plan our next move. This isn't a retreat. Clara, it's a tactical withdrawal. You sound like a soldier. I was, once, before I was a marshal. Seems I've worn a lot of badges in my life, trying to figure out where I belong. He looked at her across the fire. What about you? What did you do before you were a seamstress? I was a wife, Clara said simply. A farmer's wife. Got up before dawn to milk cows and gather eggs. Spent my days cooking and cleaning and mending. Thought that would be my whole life. She pulled her shawl tighter. Then Samuel took sick. Lung fever. Doctors said it was from years of breathing grain dust. He lingered for months, getting weaker every day, and all I could do was watch. I'm sorry. Don't be. Samuel was a good man, but our marriage was practical. We were partners more than lovers. When he died, I grieved, but I also felt, she searched for the words, free for the first time in my life. I could choose my own path, so I chose to come west, to a place where no one knew me as Samuel's widow or Benjamin's daughter. Just Clara. And then you met Thomas Garrett. And then I met you, she countered, meeting his eyes. Something shifted in the air between them, a recognition of shared loss and unexpected connection. Elias looked away first, adding another stick to the fire. You should get some rest, he said. I'll keep watch. Clara wanted to protest, to explore whatever was growing between them, but exhaustion was catching up with her. She made a pallet near the fire with her bedroll and lay down, acutely aware of Elias's presence just feet away. Thank you, she murmured. For getting me out, for everything. Sleep, Clara, he said softly. Tomorrow brings its own challenges. As she drifted off, Clara thought she heard him whisper something else, but the words were lost to dreams of midnight riders and desert stars. The sandstorm hit just after dawn. Clara woke to the sound of wind shrieking through the gaps in the stone walls. Dust was already swirling in the air, turning the morning light an ominous yellow-brown. She sat up quickly, coughing as grit filled her lungs. Elias. He was at the window, trying to secure a piece of canvas over the opening. His black clothes were already coated with dust. "Storm came out of nowhere," he shouted over the wind. "We need to get the horses inside." They stumbled out into the maelstrom. The wind hit Clara like a physical blow, nearly knocking her off her feet. Sand stung every inch of exposed skin, and she could barely see 3 feet in front of her. The horses were whinnying in terror, pulling at their tethers, working together. They managed to lead the animals into the building's main room. The horses' eyes rolled white with fear, but they calmed somewhat once out of the direct assault of wind and sand. "This could last hours," Elias said, securing the door with a wooden beam. "Maybe all day." They retreated to the back room where they'd spent the night, stuffing cloth into every gap they could find. Still, the dust crept in, coating everything in a fine layer of grit. Clara wrapped her shawl around her nose and mouth, but it barely helped. "At least Garrett's men won't be searching in this," she said, trying for optimism. Elias gave her a grim smile, silver lining to every storm. They huddled near the cold fireplace. Lighting a fire would only draw more dust through the chimney. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling the old building's bones. In the dim light filtering through the dust, Clara could barely make out Elias's features. "I've never seen a storm this bad," she admitted, pulling her knees to her chest. "They happen sometimes, out in the deep desert. Sand devils, some call them, can strip the skin off a man if he's caught in the open." He shifted closer to her, whether for warmth or comfort. She couldn't tell. "We're safe enough in here. These stone walls have weathered worse." Hours passed in a strange twilight. They shared water sparingly, knowing they'd need to clean the well of sand before they could draw more. The constant shriek of wind made conversation difficult, so they sat in companionable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. It was during a brief lull that Clara finally asked the question that had been burning in her mind. "After Sarah died, why didn't you just leave, find somewhere new to start over?" Elias was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible above the wind. "I tried. Went to California, then Oregon, but everywhere I went, I saw the same thing. Men like Garrett, using fear and hatred to control others. Good people too scared or too beaten down to fight back." He paused, absently rubbing the scar on his face. "Sarah used to say that evil flourishes when good people do nothing. I couldn't save her, but maybe I could save others. Give them the chance to fight back. By becoming the Midnight Rider. By becoming what the towns needed. Sometimes that's a defender. Sometimes it's just a reminder that someone cares enough to stand up." He looked at her through the dim light. "You understand that. It's why you hit that raider. Why you refused Garrett. You couldn't stand by and do nothing." Clara felt tears prick her eyes, though whether from emotion or the constant irritation of dust, she couldn't say, "I'm not brave. Elias, I'm terrified most of the time." "Bravery isn't the absence of fear," he said softly. "It's acting despite it." The wind picked up again with renewed fury, and they pressed closer together. Clara found herself leaning against Elias's shoulder, drawing comfort from his solid presence. He stiffened at first, then slowly relaxed, his arm coming around her shoulders. "Tell me about Pennsylvania," she said, needing to focus on something beyond the storm. "What was it like?" "Green," he said with a slight smile. "So green it hurt your eyes after being in the desert. Sarah's family had a farm outside Lancaster. Rolling hills, streams that ran clear and cold. Her mother grew the biggest tomatoes I'd ever seen." His voice took on a distant quality. "We were married in the little church on the hill. Sarah wore her grandmother's dress and wildflowers in her hair. I thought I was the luckiest man alive." "You were," Clara said softly. "Yes," he agreed. "I was." They lapsed into silence again. But it was a warmer silence now, filled with shared understanding. Clara found herself studying his profile in the dim light, the strong jaw, the lines carved by sun and sorrow, the eyes that had seen too much but still held kindness. "What is it?" he asked, catching her gaze. "I was thinking." she said slowly. "About how strange life is. If Samuel hadn't died, if I hadn't come west, if my shop hadn't burned. All these terrible things led me here, to this moment. Fate has a twisted sense of humor." Elias agreed. "Or maybe," Clara said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "maybe some things are meant to be. Maybe the pain we've endured was preparing us for something greater." The wind howled around them, sand hissing against stone like 1,000 serpents. In the strange twilight of the storm, Clara felt as if they existed outside of time, in a place where past and future held no meaning. There was only now, only this moment of connection between two wounded souls. "Clara," Elias began, his voice rough with emotion, but she was already turning toward him, her hand finding his stubbled cheek. "I know," she whispered. "I know we barely know each other. I know this is madness, but Elias, when I'm with you, I feel—" She struggled for words. "Alive. For the first time since Samuel died. Maybe for the first time ever. I feel truly alive." His hand covered hers, pressing it against his face. "You deserve better than a man who lives in shadows, who brings danger wherever he goes. And you deserve better than a woman using you to forget her loneliness." Clara countered. "But here we are." "Here we are," he echoed. The space between them disappeared. His lips found hers in the swirling darkness. Gentle at first, then with growing passion. Clara felt something break open inside her chest, a wall she'd built around her heart crumbling like sand. She kissed him back with all the longing of her lonely months, all the fear and hope and desperate need for connection. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing hard. Elias rested his forehead against hers, his hands tangled in her dust-coated hair. "This complicates things," he said with a shaky laugh. "Everything's already complicated." Clara replied, "What's one more complication?" He kissed her again, softer this time, and she melted against him. In the midst of the storm, they found a different kind of shelter in each other's arms. It was then, in that moment of perfect vulnerability, that Clara whispered the words that would echo through the rest of their story. She thought he wanted a seamstress, until the midnight rider demanded her heart and her heat. Elias pulled back slightly, studying her face. "Is that what you think? That I demand anything from you?" "No," Clara said, touching his face again. "But you have it anyway. My heart, my heat, my hope. It's yours. Elias Kane, God help us both, but it's yours." The storm raged on around them, but they no longer noticed. They talked in whispers, sharing stories of their pasts, dreams they'd abandoned, hopes they barely dared voice. Clara told him about the baby she'd lost early in her marriage, the grief that had created the first crack between her and Samuel. Elias spoke of his parents, killed by outlaws when he was barely 16, setting him on the path to becoming a lawman. "We're both orphans," Clara observed. "Cut loose from everything that once defined us. Maybe that's why we understand each other." Elias suggested, "We know what it's like to rebuild from nothing." As the day wore on, the storm began to weaken. The shrieking wind dropped to a moan, then to a whisper. Dust still hung thick in the air, but shafts of actual sunlight began to pierce the gloom. Elias stood and peered out through a crack in the shutters. "It's passing. We should check on the horses, see about clearing the well." But before he could move, Clara caught his hand. "Elias, what happens now? Between us? I mean—" He turned back to her, his expression serious. "I don't know," he admitted. "I can't offer you safety or stability. I can't even offer you a real name. Elias Kane is just one of many I've used. I'm not asking for promises," Clara said. "I'm just asking, don't shut me out. Whatever comes next, let me face it with you." He squeezed her hand. "You may regret that request. I've regretted a lot of things in my life," Clara said firmly. "But I won't regret this. I won't regret you." They ventured outside to find the world transformed. Sand drifts reached halfway up some buildings, and the familiar landmarks were obscured or erased entirely. The sky was still hazy, but clearing rapidly, revealing the harsh beauty of the desert afternoon. The horses were shaken, but unharmed, while Elias tended to them. Clara worked on clearing the well's opening. The physical labor felt good after hours of enforced stillness. As she worked, she found herself humming, something she hadn't done since Samuel's death. "You sound happy," Elias observed. "Leading the horses to drink." "I am," Clara realized with some surprise. "Despite everything, Garrett, the storm, the uncertainty, I'm happy." He smiled, a real smile that transformed his usually stern features. "It suits you." They spent the rest of the afternoon making the assay office more habitable, clearing sand and reinforcing weak spots in the walls. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Elias grew serious again. "We need to make a decision," he said. "We can't stay here indefinitely. Either we keep running, find somewhere Garrett will never think to look, or we go back." Clara finished. "We fight. It's not just Garrett anymore. With 20 more men, he'll have a small army. The townspeople who stayed won't be able to resist. Then we find help," Clara said. "There must be federal marshals, or the army, or someone who can stop him. That would take weeks, maybe months. By then, Garrett will have turned Redemption Creek into his personal kingdom." Clara felt frustration rise in her chest. "So, what do you suggest? That we just abandon everyone? Let Garrett win?" "I suggest," Elias said carefully, "that we're smart about this. Garrett thinks you're just a seamstress. He doesn't know about your courage, your intelligence. He certainly doesn't know about us." He paused. "We could use that. Go back separately. You return to town. Claim you got lost in the storm. I continue as the Midnight Rider, but now with someone on the inside. A spy," Clara said slowly. "You want me to be your spy?" "I want you to be safe," Elias corrected. "But if you're determined to fight, then yes, your shop is a gathering place. People talk while you mend their clothes. You could learn things, pass information." Clara considered this. It was dangerous, perhaps more dangerous than facing Garrett openly. But it was also clever, using Garrett's dismissal of her as just a woman against him. "All right," she said finally. "But we do this as partners. No noble attempts to protect me by keeping me in the dark. We share everything, plans, risks, decisions." "Agreed." Elias held out his hand, and they shook on it, a formal gesture that somehow felt more binding than their earlier kisses. As darkness fell over the ghost town, they prepared for one more night in Fortuna. Tomorrow, Clara would return to Redemption Creek to face whatever Thomas Garrett had in store. But tonight, she had the warmth of a small fire, the comfort of Elias's presence, and the knowledge that she was no longer alone in her fight. "No regrets?" Elias asked as they settled in for the night. "No regrets," Clara confirmed, finding his hand in the darkness. Outside, the desert wind whispered secrets to the stars, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, wild and free and unafraid. The sound of gunfire echoed through the canyon like thunder, each shot sending Clara's heart racing faster. She pressed herself against the rocky outcrop, trying to make herself smaller as bullets whined overhead. Beside her, Elias was returning fire, his face grim with concentration. "How many?" she shouted over the noise. 6, maybe 7, he called back, ejecting spent cartridges from his rifle. "They were waiting for us." It had been 3 days since they'd left Fortuna. 3 days of careful travel through hidden passes and dried creek beds, making their way back toward Redemption Creek. They'd been so careful, so watchful, but somehow, Garrett's men had found them. Another volley of shots chipped stone fragments from their cover. Clara felt warm wetness on her cheek and realized she was bleeding from a flying rock splinter. She wiped it away impatiently, her hands surprisingly steady as she checked Samuel's old revolver. "Can we make it to the horses?" she asked. Elias shook his head. "They've got us pinned. The moment we move, we're dead." The outlaws were positioned on the ridge above them, commanding the high ground. Clara and Elias had taken shelter in a cluster of boulders, but it was temporary at best. Soon, Garrett's men would work their way around, surrounding them completely. "Elias," Clara said quietly, "you should go. Use me as a distraction and—" "Don't!" His voice was sharp. "We both leave, or neither of us does." Another shot. Closer this time. Clara could hear the outlaws calling to each other, coordinating their approach. Her mouth was dry as dust, but her mind was strangely clear. She thought of her shop, of the people in Redemption Creek still fighting Garrett's tyranny. She thought of the life she'd just begun to build, the unexpected love she'd found in the midst of chaos. "I have an idea," she said suddenly. "But you're not going to like it?" Before Elias could stop her, Clara stood up, hands raised. "Don't shoot," she called out. "I surrender." "Clara, no!" Elias grabbed for her, but she stepped out of reach. The gunfire ceased. After a moment, a familiar voice called down, Well, Mrs. Whitford, Garrett's been looking for you." Cole Matthews, one of Garrett's lieutenants, emerged from behind a boulder, rifle trained on her. Other men followed, surrounding their position. Elias had no choice but to lower his weapon. "Drop the guns," Matthews ordered. "Both of you." They complied. Clara's revolver and Elias's rifle clattering on the stones. Matthews grinned, revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "The boss is going to be real happy about this. The runaway seamstress and the midnight rider. Both in one day." He gestured with his rifle. "On your feet, rider. Hands where we can see them." Elias stood slowly, his dark eyes never leaving Matthews' face. "Let her go. She's got nothing to do with this." "Oh, I think she's got plenty to do with it," Matthews sneered. "Woman who defies the Brotherhood, rides with the territory's most wanted man? No, she's coming with us." They were searched roughly, hands tied behind their backs. Clara bit her lip to keep from crying out when the ropes cut into her wrists. She caught Elias's eye, trying to convey without words that she had a plan, that he should trust her. The ride back toward Redemption Creek was a nightmare of dust and discomfort. Clara was thrown across a saddle like a sack of grain, her ribs screaming with each jolting step. But she used the time to think, to refine the desperate gambit taking shape in her mind. As the sun reached its zenith, they stopped at an abandoned way station to water the horses. Clara was hauled roughly to the ground, her legs barely supporting her after the punishing ride. "Water," she gasped. "Please," Matthews laughed. "Thirsty? Are you? Well, maybe if you ask real nice." His words were cut off by a wet, choking sound. Clara looked up to see an arrow protruding from his throat. Matthews clawed at it, eyes wide with shock, before toppling backward. Chaos erupted. More arrows whistled from the rocks, finding their targets with deadly accuracy. Garrett's men scrambled for cover, firing wildly at enemies they couldn't see. In the confusion, Clara felt hands at her bonds, cutting them free. "This way!" a voice hissed. Charlie Red Crow, a half-Apache scout she'd mended clothes for, pulled her toward a gap in the rocks. "Quickly! Elias! Already free! Move!" Clara ran, stumbling over loose stones, her body protesting every step. Behind them, the gunfire intensified. She caught a glimpse of Elias, fighting hand-to-hand with one of Garrett's men, before Charlie dragged her around a corner. A dozen Apache warriors waited with horses. Charlie boosted Clara onto one, then mounted his own. "Ride," he commanded. They thundered through the desert, leaving the sounds of battle behind. Clara clung to the horse's mane, her mind reeling, when they finally stopped in a hidden canyon miles away. She found Elias already there, sporting a split lip but otherwise unharmed. "Charlie," Elias said, clasping the scout's arm. "I owe you." "You owe me nothing," Charlie replied. "Clara mended my daughter's dress last month. No charge. When I had no money, my people pay their debts." As the Apache warriors melted back into the desert, Charlie explained. He'd been watching the town, seen Clara leave with Elias, noticed Garrett's men following. It had taken him 3 days to gather his kinsmen and track them down. Garrett's made enemies of many people, Charlie said. Not just in town, the Apache, the Mexican families he's driven out, the Chinese miners he's cheated, all waiting for someone to show them how to fight back. Clara felt a spark of hope. Would they fight if we gave them the chance? Charlie's weathered face was thoughtful. Perhaps, if they believed they could win. As they rested in the shade of a massive cottonwood, Elias cleaned and bandaged Clara's wrists. His touch was gentle, but she could see the anger in his eyes. That was reckless, he said quietly. You could have been killed. But I wasn't, and now we know something important. Garrett's men aren't invincible. They can be beaten. At what cost? His fingers traced the rope burns on her skin. Clara, if something had happened to you, she covered his hand with hers. But it didn't. And look what we've gained. Allies we didn't know we had. Charlie, how many fighting men could you gather? Maybe 20, 30, Charlie said. But warriors alone won't take the town. Garrett has fortified it, controls the water, the food supplies. Then we don't take the town, Clara said slowly. A plan forming. We make him come to us. Over the next hours, as the sun tracked across the sky, they refined the plan. It was audacious, dangerous, requiring precise timing and considerable luck, but it could work. Garrett's weakness is his pride, Clara explained. He sees himself as a conqueror, building an empire. What happens when that empire starts crumbling from within? The plan required Clara to return to town, to play the part of the terrified, defeated seamstress. She would spread word of her rescue by savage Indians, how the Midnight Rider had abandoned her to save himself. Meanwhile, Elias and Charlie would work to unite the scattered groups opposing Garrett, preparing for a coordinated strike. I don't like it, Elias said for the dozenth time as they prepared to part ways. Too many things could go wrong. Everything could go wrong, Clara agreed. But doing nothing means Garrett wins. The people of Redemption Creek deserve better. As twilight painted the desert purple and gold, Clara prepared for the journey back to town. Charlie had provided a gentler horse and supplies, and one of his warriors would shadow her, ensuring she arrived safely. 2 weeks, Elias said, gripping her shoulders. If we haven't acted in 2 weeks, take Charlie's offer, let him get you somewhere safe. And leave you to fight alone? Never. He kissed her then, fierce and desperate, as if trying to memorize the taste of her. When they broke apart, Clara saw her own fear reflected in his eyes. Come back to me, he whispered. Always. She promised. The ride to Redemption Creek was lonely despite her invisible guardian. Clara rehearsed her story, building layers of truth around the necessary lies. By the time the town's lights appeared in the distance, she had become the character she needed to play, traumatized, frightened, defeated. She entered town slumped in the saddle, clothing torn and dusty. People emerged from buildings to stare as she rode down Main Street. By the time she reached her shop, miraculously still standing, a crowd had gathered. Mrs. Whitford. Dr. Whitman pushed through the crowd. We thought you were dead. Water, Clara croaked, not needing to feign exhaustion. Please. As people rushed to help her, Clara caught sight of Thomas Garrett standing in the doorway of the hotel. His pale eyes studied her with suspicion and something else, disappointment. Had he hoped she would simply disappear? What happened? Someone asked as Clara sipped water gratefully. Indians, she gasped. They attacked us, killed Garrett's men, the Midnight Rider. He tried to bargain with them, offered me in trade for his freedom. She let tears flow, real tears of exhaustion and strain. They laughed at him, said a seamstress was worthless. They let me go out of contempt. The crowd murmured, the story spreading like wildfire. Clara saw doubt on some faces, belief on others, but most importantly, she saw Garrett's suspicious expression shift to satisfaction. The Midnight Rider revealed as a coward who would trade a woman for his life. It was exactly the narrative Garrett wanted. You're safe now, Mary Hartley said, wrapping a shawl around Clara's shoulders. That monster won't hurt you again. Clara nodded weakly, playing her part. But inside, her heart sang a different song. Elias was out there, gathering their forces. The real fight was just beginning. As she was helped into her shop, Clara caught a glimpse of movement on the ridge, a lone Apache warrior, watching over her as promised. She was not alone. None of them were alone anymore. Rest, "Doctor," Whitman ordered. "You've been through a terrible ordeal." "Yes," Clara agreed, sinking onto her cot. "Terrible." But as she closed her eyes, she thought of Elias's kiss, of Charlie's warriors, of the fire building in the hearts of the oppressed. Garrett thought he'd won. He had no idea what was coming. In the darkness of her shop, Clara smiled. The week following Clara's return passed in a blur of careful deception. By day, she played the traumatized seamstress, jumping at shadows and speaking in whispers about her ordeal. By night, she worked by candlelight, sewing something far more dangerous than shirts or trousers. Hidden in the lining of a jacket here, sewn into the hem of a dress there, Clara concealed messages and evidence. Each scrap of paper documented Garrett's crimes: robbery, murder, extortion, names, dates, amounts stolen. Information gleaned from conversations in her shop, from documents glimpsed in the hotel, from the careless boasts of Garrett's men. "Mrs. Whitford, you're looking peaked," Margaret Spencer observed, bringing in her husband's torn vest. "That terrible experience still troubling you?" "The nightmares," Clara murmured, letting her hands tremble slightly as she examined the vest. "I keep seeing their faces, hearing the screams." Margaret patted her shoulder sympathetically. "That coward rider, leaving you to those savages. My herald says Garrett's put a bounty on him. $500, dead or alive." "Really?" Clara kept her voice neutral, though her heart raced. "That seems excessive. Not after what happened yesterday. Didn't you hear? The rider attacked a supply wagon coming from Silver City. Killed 2 of Garrett's new men. Made off with guns and ammunition." Margaret leaned closer, voice dropping. "They say he's gone mad, killing anyone associated with Garrett." Clara bent over her sewing to hide her smile. Elias was keeping Garrett's men distracted, preventing them from solidifying their control. Each attack drew more men out of town, leaving fewer to enforce Garrett's rule. That evening, as Clara closed her shop, she found Thomas Garrett himself waiting outside, her blood chilled, but she forced herself to curtsy shakily. "Mr. Garrett, Mrs. Whitford." His pale eyes studied her like a specimen. "You're recovering well, I see. Thanks to the kindness of the neighbors, sir." "Indeed." He stepped closer, and Clara smelled tobacco and something sour on his breath. "I've been thinking about your ordeal. The rider knowing exactly where to find you, the Indians appearing so conveniently. Some might find it suspicious." Clara let her eyes fill with tears. Not difficult, given her exhaustion. "Are you suggesting I wanted to be attacked? That I enjoyed watching men die?" "Of course not," Garrett said smoothly. "I merely observed that you've had remarkable luck in surviving situations that should have killed you. First the fire, now this. If you call losing everything I own twice luck, Mr. Garrett, then yes, I'm extraordinarily fortunate." He smiled coldly. "Just remember, Mrs. Whitford, luck runs out, for everyone." After he left, Clara's hands shook genuinely as she locked her door. Garrett suspected something. She needed to act soon, before he decided she was more trouble than she was worth. 2 nights later, her chance came. The moon was new, leaving the streets in darkness. Clara slipped out her back door wearing men's clothing borrowed from her mending pile, her hair tucked under a worn hat. The jacket she wore had 20 documents sewn into its lining, enough to hang Garrett and half his men. She made her way to the old mission church on the hill, abandoned since the priest died of fever 2 years ago. Inside, a figure waited in the shadows. "Clara." Elias stepped into the moonlight streaming through a broken window. He looked exhausted, beard unkempt, clothes dusty from hard riding, but his eyes lit up when he saw her. She flew into his arms, breathing in the scent of leather and sage that clung to him. For a moment, they simply held each other, drawing strength from the contact. "I've been so worried," she whispered against his chest. "I'm fine. The attacks are working. Garrett's pulled 15 men out of town to hunt me." He pulled back to study her face. "What about you? Any suspicions?" "Garrett questioned me today. He knows something's not right, but he can't quite piece it together." She stepped back, beginning to carefully cut open the jacket's lining. I have everything we need, signed orders for the raids, lists of bribes paid to officials, even a letter planning the attack on the grain storage. Elias examined the documents by lamplight, his expression growing grimmer with each page. This is enough to bring in federal marshals. Hell, it's enough to bring in the army. Charlie's warrior can take them to Fort Bayard. Clara said, "How long until—" The church door crashed open. Clara spun to see Cole Matthews, very much alive despite the arrow she'd seen in his throat, standing in the doorway with 5 armed men. Well, Matthews grinned, a vivid scar across his neck telling the story of his near death. The seamstress and her lover. Garrett's gonna give me a bonus for this. Elias moved faster than thought, shoving Clara behind the altar as guns erupted. Splinters of ancient wood filled the air as bullets tore through pews. Clara crawled toward the vestry door, clutching the precious documents. "Go!" Elias shouted, returning fire. "Get to Charlie!" But as Clara reached the door, strong hands grabbed her, hauling her backward. She fought viciously, using every dirty trick Samuel had inadvertently taught her during their wrestling matches on the farm. Her elbow found soft flesh, her boot heel a shin, but there were too many of them. "Got her!" someone yelled. "Elias, run!" Clara screamed as they dragged her toward the door. She saw him turn toward her, saw the anguish in his eyes as he weighed escape against capture. Then Matthew's rifle butt caught him across the temple, and he crumpled to the floor. "No!" Clara fought harder, but it was useless. They bound her hands, shoved a gag in her mouth, and threw her over a saddle. The ride back to town was a nightmare blur. They took her not to the jail but to the hotel, up the stairs to Garrett's private office. He sat behind a massive oak desk, examining the recovered documents by lamplight. "Fascinating reading," he said without looking up. "Did you compile all this yourself? Or did you have help?" Clara's gag was removed. She worked her jaw, glaring at him. "Go to hell. Eventually. I'm sure." He set the papers aside, finally meeting her eyes. "You've caused me considerable inconvenience. Mrs. Whitford. My employers in Silver City are asking questions about missing shipments. Dead men. They're threatening to find someone else to run this territory." "Good." Garrett stood, walking around the desk to loom over her. "You think you're clever. You think your little rebellion matters, but let me explain reality to you." He gripped her chin, forcing her to meet his eyes. "By dawn, the Midnight Rider will hang in the street as an example. You'll watch from this window. Then, depending on how cooperative you are, you'll either join him or spend the rest of your short life wishing you had." Clara spat in his face. Garrett backhanded her, sending her sprawling. "Matthews, lock her up. Post guards. If she escapes, you'll take her place on the gallows." They dragged Clara to a storage room, shoved her inside, and barred the door. She heard boots settling outside, at least 2 guards. Clara slumped against the wall, tasting blood from her split lip. Dawn. Elias would hang at dawn, and with him would die the hope of Redemption Creek. Unless... She examined her prison. The room was small, windowless, used for storing linens. Shelves lined the walls, stacked with sheets and tablecloths. Above, barely visible in the darkness, was a small ventilation grate. Clara smiled grimly. They'd locked up a seamstress in a room full of fabric, working quickly. She began knotting sheets together, testing each connection. Her fingers, trained by years of detailed work, flew through the knots. Soon she had a rope nearly 20 feet long. Standing on a shelf, she examined the ventilation grate. The screws were old, corroded. Using a hairpin, she worked at them patiently, ignoring the protests from her battered body. One screw came loose, then another. Within an hour, she had the grate free. The opening was barely large enough for her slim frame. Clara tied one end of her makeshift rope to a sturdy shelf, then squeezed into the ventilation shaft. It was a nightmare of darkness and suffocating closeness. She inched forward, following the shaft as it angled upward. Dust filled her lungs, and more than once she had to stop. fighting panic. Then, blessed relief, another grate, this one opening into an attic space. Clara pushed it free and hauled herself out, gasping. She was above the hotel's 3rd floor. Through gaps in the floorboards, she could hear voices, footsteps. Somewhere below, Elias was prisoner. Somewhere out there. Charlie and his warriors waited for a signal. Clara crept across the attic, searching for a way down. She found it in an access ladder leading to a hallway closet. Carefully, she descended. The hallway was empty. Most of Garrett's men would be preparing for the morning's execution. Clara ghosted along, checking doors. Storage, empty room. Office. She froze. Through the cracked door, she glimpsed Elias tied to a chair, Matthews pacing before him. Could make this easier. Matthews was saying, "Tell us where the other rebels are hiding. Where's the Apache camp? Who else in town is helping you?" Elias's voice was rough but steady. "The only thing I'll tell you is that you're going to hang for your crimes. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon." Matthews laughed. Big words for a dead man. Clara weighed her options. She needed a distraction, something to draw Matthews away. Then she remembered. Garrett kept his whiskey in the office across the hall. Good whiskey, expensive whiskey, flammable whiskey. Moving silently, she slipped into the office. Bottles lined a shelf, gleaming in the lamplight. Clara grabbed one, pulled the cork, and splashed the contents across the floor and furniture. Then, using a lamp, she set it alight. The alcohol ignited with a whoosh. Clara darted back to the hallway as smoke began billowing out. "Fire!" someone yelled. "Fire in the boss's office!" Matthews burst from the room holding Elias, saw the flames, and cursed. "Watch him!" he ordered unseen guards, then ran toward the fire. Clara waited until he passed, then slipped into the room. 2 guards remained, but they were focused on the commotion outside. Samuel's revolver, taken from her and left on a table, caught her eye. She grabbed it, cocked the hammer. "Hands up, now!" The guards spun, saw the gun in her steady hands, and slowly raised their arms. "Clara," Elias breathed. "How?" Questions later. She kept the gun trained on the guards while using her free hand to cut Elias's bonds. "We need to go! Now!" Shouts echoed through the hotel as the fire spread. Smoke was already seeping under the door. Elias grabbed the guards' weapons, then used their own ropes to tie them up. "The window," he said. "It's only a dozen feet to the roof next door." They smashed through the glass as smoke filled the room. The drop looked much farther than 12 feet, but they had no choice. Behind them, orange flames were already licking at the door frame. "Together," Elias said, gripping her hand. They jumped. The impact drove all breath from Clara's lungs. She rolled, gravel tearing at her clothes. Then Elias was pulling her up, urging her on. They ran across rooftops as the hotel blazed behind them. Garrett's empire literally going up in smoke. At the edge of town, Charlie Red Crow waited with horses and warriors. "The signal?" he asked. "Burning bright," Elias confirmed. Looking back at the inferno, Garrett's men will be busy saving what they can. Time to take back the town. As dawn broke over Redemption Creek, it illuminated a very different scene than Garrett had planned. Instead of an execution, the townspeople woke to find Garrett's stronghold in ashes and armed Apache warriors patrolling their streets. Those of Garrett's men who hadn't fled were rounded up, disarmed, and locked in their own jail. Garrett himself was found trying to escape with saddlebags full of stolen money. Charlie's warriors brought him back tied across a horse, his pale eyes no longer holding any trace of arrogance. "Federal marshals will be here within the week," Clara announced to the gathered crowd, holding up the salvaged documents. "These men will face real justice for their crimes." A ragged cheer went up. For the first time in months, the people of Redemption Creek had hope. As the sun climbed higher, Clara stood with Elias overlooking the town. Her dress was ruined, her face smudged with soot, her body aching from the night's adventures. But her heart was light. "So," Elias said, slipping an arm around her waist. "What now?" The Midnight Rider's work here is done. Maybe it's time for Elias Kane to try living in the light. Clara suggested. I hear there's an opening for sheriff. He laughed, pressing a kiss to her temple. A sheriff and a seamstress. What will people say? That Redemption Creek is finally living up to its name. Clara replied, that sometimes, from the ashes of what was, something better can grow. Below them, the town began the work of rebuilding once again, but this time they built on a foundation of justice, equality, and hope. And if sometimes people still spoke of the Midnight Rider, it was no longer in fear, but in gratitude for the mysterious figure who'd reminded them that one person, or two, really could make a difference. Dawn broke over the desert in shades of rose and gold, painting the red rocks in colors that seemed too beautiful for the harsh landscape. Clara stood by the creek that gave the town its name, watching the water catch the early light. The stream ran clearer now than it had in months, no longer muddied by the constant traffic of Garrett's men watering stolen cattle. You're up early, Elias said, approaching with 2 cups of coffee. Clara accepted one gratefully, breathing in the bitter aroma. Couldn't sleep. Too much has happened. Too much has changed. It had been 2 weeks since Garrett's arrest. The federal marshals had come and gone, taking him and his surviving men to face trial in Santa Fe. The town had erupted in celebration, but Clara had felt strangely empty afterward, as if the fight had been the only thing holding her together. Change isn't always comfortable, Elias observed, standing beside her. He'd kept the sheriff's badge the townspeople had pressed on him, though he wore it uncomfortably, like new boots that hadn't been broken in yet. It's not that, Clara said. It's... What comes next? We fought so hard to free this town, but now that we have... I don't know where I belong in it. Elias was quiet for a moment. Then, you belong wherever you choose to belong. That's what freedom means. They stood in companionable silence, watching the sun climb higher. Around them, Redemption Creek was waking up. Hammers rang as people repaired buildings damaged in the fighting. Children's laughter echoed from the schoolhouse, which had reopened with a new teacher, Margaret Chen, who discovered a gift for education while helping tend the wounded. I need to tell you something, Clara said suddenly. About Samuel, about our marriage. Elias turned to her, waiting. I told you it was practical, and it was... But I didn't tell you why. She took a deep breath. I was with child when we married, not his, another man's, someone who promised marriage then disappeared when I told him. Samuel knew. He married me anyway, gave me respectability, gave my child a name. What happened to the baby? Lost it 3 months later. Samuel never blamed me, but I blamed myself. I thought it was punishment for my sin, for trying to hide the truth. Tears pricked her eyes. When he died, part of me was relieved, not because I wanted him gone, but because I could finally stop pretending to be something I wasn't. Elias set down his coffee and took her hands. Clara, look at me. She met his eyes reluctantly. You are the bravest, strongest, most honest person I know, he said firmly. Whatever happened in your past shaped you into who you are today, and who you are today is extraordinary. Even knowing I'm not the virtuous widow everyone thinks. Especially knowing that, because it means you understand what it's like to be judged, to be condemned for circumstances beyond your control. It's what made you stand up to Garrett when others couldn't. Clara felt something tight in her chest loosen. Sarah was lucky to have you, she whispered. And I'm lucky to have found you, he replied. If you'll have me. That is, a former outlaw turned sheriff isn't much of a catch. Before Clara could respond, a commotion erupted from Main Street. They hurried toward the noise, hands instinctively reaching for weapons that, thankfully, they no longer needed to carry constantly. A crowd had gathered around a wagon laden with lumber and supplies. At its head sat Tom Hartley, grinning broadly despite his still healing shoulder. Delivery for Mrs. Whitford, he called out. Courtesy of grateful citizens. Clara stared. What is this? Mary Hartley climbed down from the wagon. It's for your new shop, of course. Bigger than the last one, with proper living quarters attached. We all chipped in, But I can't accept— Yes, you can. Doctor, Whitman interrupted. Emerging from the crowd, this town owes you more than we can ever repay. Let us start with this. Clara looked around at the faces surrounding her, people she'd sewn for, fought beside, bled with. Charlie Red Crow was there, his usually stoic face soft with approval. Beth Morrison stood with her brother Jake, both beaming. Even some of Garrett's former men who'd chosen to stay and make amends were present, hats in hand. I don't know what to say. Say you'll stay. Someone called out. Redemption Creek needs its seamstress. And its sheriff needs his bride, another voice added, causing laughter and Clara's cheeks to burn. Elias cleared his throat. Well, since the whole town seems to be here. He dropped to one knee, pulling a simple gold band from his pocket. Clara Whitford, you've already said you'll have me. Will you marry me? Here, in front of these witnesses. In the town we'd fought to save? Clara's heart stopped. Around them, the crowd held its collective breath. Yes, she said, voice clear and strong. Yes, I'll marry you. Elias Kane. The crowd erupted in cheers. As Elias slipped the ring onto her finger, Clara felt the last walls around her heart crumble. This was home. These people were family. The pain and loss that had driven them here had been transformed into something beautiful. The wedding took place that evening, in the mission church they'd fought in just weeks before. Someone had swept out the broken glass and bullet casings, hung wildflowers from the rafters. Clara wore her one good dress, hastily mended, with desert roses in her hair. Elias had shaved and found a clean shirt, looking more nervous than he had facing down outlaws. Dearly beloved, the circuit preacher began, having arrived just that morning as if guided by providence. We gather here in this place of conflict turned to peace, to witness the union of two souls who found each other in the darkness and chose to walk together into the light. Clara barely heard the words, lost in Elias's eyes. When it came time for vows, she spoke from her heart. I came to this place seeking a new beginning, never knowing I would find my ending, the ending of loneliness, of running, of being afraid. You showed me that strength isn't about standing alone, but about standing together. I promise to stand with you, come what may. Elias's voice was rough with emotion as he replied, You gave me purpose when I had none, hope when I'd forgotten its meaning. You reminded me that justice without love is just vengeance, and that even someone lost in darkness can find their way home. I promise to love you, protect you, and walk beside you, whether in shadow or in sun. Then, by the power vested in me, the preacher pronounced, I declare you husband and wife. Sheriff, you may kiss your bride. The kiss was tender, a promise sealed before friends and beneath stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Around them, the people of Redemption Creek cheered and wept and celebrated the triumph of love over hate, hope over fear. The reception spilled out onto Main Street, with tables groaning under food contributed by every household. Charlie's people had provided venison, the Mexican families tamales and rice, the Chinese miners tea and delicate pastries. It was a feast of unity, a celebration of what Redemption Creek could be when fear no longer divided them. As Clara danced with her new husband under strings of lanterns, she caught sight of movement on the ridge. For a moment, her heart seized. Old habits died hard, but it was only a lone rider pausing to look down at the celebration before continuing on his way. The midnight rider's last sighting, Elias murmured in her ear, following her gaze. Let him become legend now. Elias Kane has better things to do, such as building a life with his wife, keeping the peace in a town that's learning what peace means, maybe even raising children who'll never know what it's like to live in fear. Clara's heart swelled. Children? If you're willing. Sarah and I never got the chance. But maybe we can have what was stolen from both of us. Clara finished. A family, a future, a home. They danced on as the stars wheeled overhead. The same stars that had witnessed their flight through the desert, their desperate stand against tyranny, their unexpected love. Around them, Redemption Creek celebrated not just a wedding, but a new beginning. In the months that followed, the town transformed. Clara's new shop became a gathering place for women of all backgrounds. Sharing stories and skills, the school expanded, teaching children in 3 languages. The church was properly repaired, serving all faiths. Former enemies worked side by side, building something greater than any one group could achieve alone. And if sometimes, on very dark nights when trouble threatened, someone might glimpse a rider in black watching from the ridges, well, that was just legend. Sheriff Elias Kane was always home with his wife. Everyone could attest to that. The fact that his black coat sometimes smelled of sage and night wind was purely coincidental. Clara stood once more by the creek, 5 years later, watching her daughter splash in the shallows while her son toddled after butterflies. Her seamstress shop was thriving, employing 3 other women now. Elias approached from town, his sheriff's badge glinting in the sun. That same easy grace in his movements that had first caught her attention. "Any regrets?" he asked, settling beside her on the bank. Clara looked at their children, Sarah with her father's dark eyes and her mother's determined chin, Samuel with his mother's golden hair and his father's quiet strength. She thought of all the pain that had brought them here, all the loss that had preceded this joy. "No regrets," she said firmly. "Every step led us here, every sorrow, every triumph. We are who we are because of where we've been." Elias took her hand, the simple gold band warm against her skin. "Then here's to the future. Mrs. Kane, may it be as adventurous as our beginning." "But perhaps with less gunfire," Clara suggested with a laugh. "Perhaps," he agreed, pulling her close as their children's laughter rang across the water. The sun set over Redemption Creek, painting the desert in shades of hope and promise, and somewhere in the distance, carried on the wind, came the faint echo of hoofbeats, not a threat, but a reminder that some legends never truly die. They just transform into something new, in a town that had found its redemption. A seamstress and a sheriff had found their home. And that, as any storyteller would agree, is the best ending of all, which is really just another beginning. Thank you all for joining me on this wild journey through the Old West. I hope Clara and Elias's story touched your heart as much as it touched mine while telling it. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening to this tale. Are you by a cozy fire, on a long drive, or perhaps even somewhere out in the wide open spaces that our characters called home? Please subscribe to Wild West Campfire for more stories of love, courage, and redemption in the American frontier. And don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, partners, keep riding toward that horizon.